Hi, my name is Lizzie, and I work for the International Crane Foundation. I'm going to be talking to all of you about my experience doing a marketing campaign for whooping cranes. And I, told Josh I don't have a communications background, so this is all was all kind of learn as I go for me. So I'm just going to talk to you about my experiences, and maybe we'll just have a conversation afterwards. I work for the International Crane Foundation. For those of you not familiar with us, we work worldwide to conserve cranes and the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. Whooping cranes are one of 15 crane species that are located on 5 continents, and we have worked in over 50 countries. But I'm going to focus on whooping cranes, this bird right here, because they are the rarest crane species in the world, and they're found right here in North America. This species numbers currently at a little over 800 individuals in the global population, which doesn't sound like a lot, but they're actually on the upswing. In the 1940s and 50s, this species nearly went extinct, got down to about 20 to 30 individuals. So those were two primary reasons. One was habitat loss. A lot of wetlands were being destroyed, and this is a wetland-dependent species. Also, hunting, so unregulated hunting, market hunting, hunting for collections and museums, for recreation, for sustenance, for the millinery trade. There was a commercial value for birds with white feathers. So because of unregulated habitat loss and unregulated hunting, we nearly lost this species. The green in this map represents the historic range of whooping cranes. And in the 1940s and 50s, the entire population of whooping cranes got down to a single flyway, a single flock that still exists today. We call it the Aransas wood buffalo population. In 1941, this scientists surveyed this population and could only find 15 individuals. So possible that there were more than that scientists couldn't find, but we came very close to losing this species. I'm going to focus more on another flock that exists called the Eastern migratory population. This is a reintroduced population that was established with the use of ultralight aircraft, so you might be somewhat familiar with that story. Looking at this population, so if we look at diagnosed causes of death, so when we can actually obtain a carcass and determine cause of death, 19% of the time we've seen that is from gunshot. So we don't really know if this is having a significant impact on whooping cranes, but this is a long-lived species with a low reproductive rate, and so losing especially adult birds can be devastating for such a small population such as the EMP, which currently only has about 100 individuals in it and is not self-sustaining. And so when I was hired, it was specifically to address gunshot. Why is this happening? What are the patterns that we're seeing? How do we get this to stop or to reduce? So one of the first things I did was gather information on confirmed shooting cases. So since the whooping crane was listed as a federally endangered species in 1967, there have been, I think now, the last tally is 29 confirmed shooting cases. So this graph breaks these cases into 5-year bins starting in 1965. And then the different colors are the different populations. So up until the 1990s, there really was only one population of whooping cranes called the Aransas wood buffalo population. And so that's this kind of gold color here. So those were the only shootings that we saw. Starting in the 1990s, we started to do reintroductions, and then we started to see a real uptick in the number of shooting cases. But the question is, why are we seeing that? I think a lot of it has to do with detectability. So the Aransas wood buffalo population only has about 2% of the individuals that are banded or have any type of radio telemetry devices on them. So they're we do survey them, but they're monitored at a much lower rate than the reintroduced populations where 100% of the individuals are banded, and many of them have working radio telemetry or satellite or cell tower telemetry devices on them. So our detectability is much higher in the reintroduced populations. There are probably other factors that contribute to why we see more confirmed shooting cases in the reintroduced populations. But the reintroduced populations are not self-sustaining. Again, they have small numbers. And so when we see these shootings happen, it's really concerning for us, and so we really wanted to address it. And so I looked at these cases and tried to figure out, what are some commonalities between the cases? How can we use this information to design an outreach campaign, or to pick any strategies to address this behavior? One really common comment that I still get is that this is hunters who are doing it. It's those darn hunters, and they're making a mistake when they should be shooting something else. And so that's something I looked at really quickly, like right away, is it really hunters that are doing this? I think if we add in this chart's a little bit old because we've had a shooting since then. I think we're at about 24% of these cases are hunter related. But if we look closely at that orange part of this pie, what's going on there is those are cases where usually a waterfowl hunter, sometimes a sandhill crane hunter, which is, that type of hunting is legal in a lot of states. They've violated a hunting regulation. So, for example, around Aransas National Wildlife Refuge on the Gulf Coast of Texas, there is sandhill crane hunting allowed except in a closed zone where the majority of the whooping cranes are located. So about 500 something whooping cranes winter in the closed zone. So there's no sandhill crane hunting allowed. But over the years, a number of sandhill crane hunters have knowingly or unknowingly violated the closed zone regulation. And they've, decided to hunt sandhills in the closed zone, and they've made a mistake and shot a whooping crane. And so a responsible hunter, somebody who works for Ducks Unlimited or Pheasants Forever or a game warden would say, well, that person's poaching because they were violating a hunting regulation. And so they might say, well, that 25% is really not hunting related, it's poaching related. But it's still useful for us because the way that we would approach outreach in a state like Texas, where we do see that more cases are related to like the closed zone regulation, is to talk to hunters specifically about that regulation. But for the most part, these cases are not related to a hunting case. It tends to be someone with a high-powered rifle shooting onto private property, often from a roadside. Sometimes they are simultaneously conducting acts of vandalism, like destroying mailboxes or something like that. They might be drunk, or drugs might be involved as well. And so those people aren't hunters. We sometimes refer to those cases as vandalistic shootings. I also looked at where these cases took place. So this map shows locations of shooting cases in the United States. There is one confirmed shooting case of a whooping crane in Saskatchewan. But Texas has got, actually Texas I think is tied with Louisiana for the highest number of shooting cases, confirmed shooting cases. But I mostly work in the eastern migratory population. And so I started working on this in Alabama. Not necessarily because Alabama has more of a problem than in any other state. We just had kind of a unique opportunity to try to experiment with some things there. When I first started this job in 2015, I worked with Dr. Meredith Gore, who is a professor of wildlife criminology at Michigan State University, and she walked us through a situational crime prevention workshop. Meredith, or Dr. Gore, uses situational crime prevention to address wildlife crime throughout the world. Situational crime prevention is just a theory that in order for a crime to take place, three factors have to align in space and time. There has to be an attractive target, a motivated offender, and a lack of guardianship of the target. And if you remove just one of these factors, the crime is much less likely to occur. And this is used to address shoplifting and terrorism and wildlife crime. So really any type of crime that you could think of. Dr. Gore walked us through 25 strategies that are used to address crime. And something that kept coming up over and over again was an awareness campaign to get people aware and hopefully appreciate whooping cranes on their landscape. This reduces the possibility of a whooping crane shooting taking place because it reduces their attractiveness as a target, It reduces the motivation of the offender to shoot a whooping crane, and it increases the guardianship of whooping cranes within communities that have them. I'm going to talk about another strategy that also came up that we are using to address this this crime, kind of at the end of this talk. But since we're using an awareness campaign, we looked at an organization that has been doing awareness campaigns for changing human behaviors around species, and that organization is called RARE. So you can check out their work at rare.org. RARE only works outside of North America, but we did consult with one of their past employees who talked to us about how to use social marketing to address whooping crane shootings. One really big part of social marketing is evaluation. So understanding what your baseline is, it's the assessment part of a marketing campaign, understanding how people feel about whooping cranes and using that information to design and then evaluate a campaign. Once again, I don't have a social science or communications background. I've dabbled a lot, but I found some experts at Auburn University in Alabama who could help me with this. Dr. Wade Morris worked with me on this. He hired a master's student using funding from the Alabama Department of Wildlife and ADCNR, Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, to fund a master's student in his lab. He's a professor of human dimensions of wildlife. And she helped us assess how people in Alabama, in the area where whooping cranes winter, what do they know about whooping cranes? How do they feel about them? How can we use that information to inform a campaign? So they sent out mail surveys, and this is some of the information that came back. It was a fairly long survey that would take a person about 15 minutes to complete. And so one of the questions they asked was, how aware are members of the general public in North Alabama that whooping cranes winter there? And I think the average score on this was about 42%. They did do a non-response check to ask people why they didn't mail back the survey. They only had about a 10% response rate, which is actually kind of average for mail surveys in the United States. But a lot of people said, well, I didn't mail back the survey because I didn't know what a whooping crane was. So we actually had bias towards people who are more aware of whooping cranes. We also asked knowledge questions about whooping cranes, like how tall is a whooping crane, what color is a whooping crane, or what color is its plumage. And you can see that about 30% of people got 0 of these questions right. And we had a pretty strong bias towards low knowledge about whooping cranes. So we did an awareness campaign in North Alabama starting in the winter of 2015 to 2016 to get people excited about whooping cranes, get them to give a whoop about whooping cranes. Our most important partners in Alabama are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so my employee on the right side of this photo is hanging out with a supervisory ranger at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge, where the whooping cranes hang out, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service property. And then on the left is Mary Ratliff, who's the president of their Friends group or their volunteer group. So these were our main partners, but we had, I think, almost 30 or so other organizations that we worked with. So we did outreach activities in the North Alabama community. So a lot of tabling events, going to community events where people would be hanging out, just talking to them about whooping cranes. One thing that we learned from the surveys and just anecdotally is that people really don't know that much about whooping cranes. They don't know how to identify a whooping crane. It was really common for people, and it still is unfortunately common for people to say, oh my gosh, I saw 1,000 whooping cranes in a field the other day. But there's only 800 whooping cranes in the world and only 100 in the Eastern Flyway. And so we handed out a lot of ID guides so people could learn how to properly identify a whooping crane. We also talked to a lot of kids at field trips and had a K through 12 outreach program focusing on the whooping crane education trunk, and took that into classrooms and also trained teachers. We also had a mascot. This is, part of Rayer's strategy, what they recommended that we do is have a mascot to help people foster an emotional connection to a species that they would probably only ever see from far away. We also had billboards, but we kind of learned that we really should have taken a different approach with these billboards. These billboards say, "Give whooping cranes a sweet home, Alabama welcome." But our surveys showed that this was kind of confusing for people. They didn't know that whooping cranes are in North Alabama. I don't know what a whooping crane is. And so they didn't know why they should be proud or excited that whooping cranes are there, or why they should welcome whooping cranes. So this was a case of, we had a time frame on the billboards, and we had to get them done before we got the surveys back. Just, something that we learned about. We also learned about who people trust in North Alabama. This is Bob Baumhauer, who formerly played for University of Alabama and then played for the NFL and is now a well-known businessman in the state of Alabama. He owns a chain of local restaurants. And so he helped us by being a spokesperson for us in PSAs. And here he is in a documentary with me observing whooping cranes at Wheeler. And then, people also said that they trust this documentary series called Discovering Alabama that's played on Alabama Public Television. We also worked with the media in Alabama. So this is an article from AL.com, which is the largest owner of newspapers in Alabama. So this got a lot of distribution. We also did some fun things. So we created a whooping crane beer. I don't think it had a huge impact on awareness, but I did meet people at Wheeler who came because they read about this on a beer can. And so that was pretty interesting to learn about. We got an award from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for our outreach work, the Regional Directors Award, which is really awesome. I think it just speaks to the fact that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are really great partners of ours. We really felt good about being acknowledged by them. But the question is, did this campaign really work? And so after the campaign, we administered a survey that was pretty similar to the pre-campaign survey. We asked questions like, are you aware that whooping cranes winter in North Alabama? Here we did see an 11% increase. Our goal was a 33% increase over 3 years, or a 30% increase over 3 years. And so that helps us. We did see that people are more aware that whooping cranes are in North Alabama, but then we did see some wonky stuff going on here with basically no change, or people saying that the people around them aren't aware that whooping cranes winter in North Alabama. But somebody at NACCB explained this to me, that it actually could mean that we are seeing, we're just seeing more concern, and people are worried that their neighbors and their friends don't know about whooping cranes. So it's just interesting. More so, we did see a shift in knowledge. So we saw that more people have more knowledge about whooping cranes. So before we had this bell curve not a bell curve, we saw that everything was kind of shifted towards having zero knowledge, zero questions correct about whooping cranes. Afterwards, they actually asked more questions about whooping cranes, so 9 questions, and we saw a shift towards people getting more questions correct, which is good, and actually that's what you can expect. And that's something that we're learning. We're doing this work in Indiana as well, and just last week we finished up survey work there. People have to get knowledge before you come at them with messages about pride or appreciation for a species. If they don't know anything about the species, they're really not going to skip to those next steps. And we also asked people where they got information about whooping cranes. A lot of them were getting their information at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge, which is a really well-respected institution in North Alabama. And the awesome news is that they just got, I think, a $4 or $5 million grant to improve their visitor center, which has very minimal messaging about whooping cranes. And so they're interested in including more information about whooping cranes there, which is great. As I said, we were doing this research in Indiana as well, working off the same model that we did in Alabama, with funding from Indiana DNR for a lab at Purdue University with Dr. Linda Prokope, who is conducting surveys for us. And like I said, we're waiting on a report. We should get it this week or next week. which is exciting. So that's kind of the awareness component of this campaign, and I know I'm at 20 minutes, so maybe I'll just run through it quickly. In addition to awareness, raising awareness, we also are interested in working with the courts when a person, a perpetrator, is brought in for actually shooting a whipping crane. So when we can catch somebody, we want to increase penalties for shooting a whipping crane because it reduces motivations for an offender and it reduces the attractiveness of whipping cranes as a target. Historically, we've not had the best track record for actually prosecuting someone who shot a whooping crane. We see the best outcome when the case goes federal. So it's prosecuted under Migratory Bird Treaty Act or the Endangered Species Act, both federal laws. And you can see here the biggest fines and overall punishment have come from ESA prosecution. I'm going to talk about this case here that took place in January 2016. We do see really low fines when these things are prosecuted at the state level. So, for example, in Indiana, in November 2009, somebody shot a whooping crane and they got a $1 fine and had to pay $500 in court fees, and that was it. So I'm going to go a little bit more into this person right here, Trey Joseph Frederick, who shot 2 whooping cranes in January of 2016 in East Texas. This is a pretty sad case where this young man, he was 18 years old when he shot 2 whooping cranes, strongly identified as a hunter. This was from his Facebook page. I love to hunt, love to fish tournaments. His favorite quote is, "If it flies, it dies." So, you know, this is a case where somebody who is a hunter decided to shoot 2 whooping cranes, and there was a lot of evidence that this was basically premeditated. He told people he was going to do this. He did it. He's real sloppy about it, and he got caught. And this immediately went federal. It went Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and then they gathered evidence and brought an ESA charge. So the International Crane Foundation worked with local organizations, people who are influential in Louisiana and Texas, to try to influence the judge and district attorney in this case to convince them that whooping cranes are really valuable. A lot of times what we see is that when a judge gets a whooping crane shooting case, they don't understand what this is. They don't understand that this represents a lot of time, financial investment, and that the public actually cares about this. They're just not familiar with this type of wildlife crime. So we had a letter writing campaign. We try to convince some more influential people in East Texas and Louisiana, because that's where this took place, to contact the judge and DA. We didn't want to make this a massive letter writing campaign where thousands of letters were coming in, basically told by judges and lawyers that we talked to that judge does not want to get a mass amount of letters. It's more getting key people involved and sharing their opinions. Another thing that was really amazing was working with a journalist named Sonia Smith, who works for Texas Monthly Magazine. She wrote this awesome article called Ruffled Feathers. There's a long form article, I think it was like 5,000 words or something like that, pretty long, but really interesting article that she timed to come out in September because she knew that the sentencing was scheduled for October. So she wanted people really thinking about this. She wanted this to help influence the case in such a way that Trey Joseph Frederick would get a higher sentencing. So Sonia did a really great job on this, some great photojournalism as well. These are those 3 cranes, and I think 2 of these cranes were then shot. So I think this is a photographer who was able to get out there before the crime actually happened. And then this is a game warden, Mike Boone, who worked on the case. The article's really great. Working with Sonia was really interesting. And all of this effort resulted in a $26,000 fine to Trey Joseph Frederick. He also got his hunting and fishing license revoked in all 50 states. And he cannot own or shoot a gun for the next 5 years, which is pretty big in Texas. kind of unrelated, but just kind of showing you the type of person he is. He could not abide by the terms of his probation, violated his probation, and went to jail for 6 or 9 months, I want to say. But I think he's out now because we did get a check from him because the judge decided that half of the fine should go to the International Crane Foundation. So pretty interesting. And now I have an opportunity to work on a case that happened a few months ago in Louisiana. And that is actually going ESA. So it's going federal, which is good. Not great that we have another shooting case, but I do plan on repeating the strategy we used in Texas. Hopefully we'll see some success in a high sentencing for this person who shot a whooping crane in Louisiana. So that's what I have for you. That was 26 minutes.
Well, thanks, Lizzie. We appreciate you sharing your experience and your findings as well. I wanted to ask on just a couple follow-up points here. You mentioned the importance or the key role of working with folks. I think it was Wade Morris at Auburn. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that partnership of working with social scientists for some of that kind of research piece that's obviously pretty key to some of the communications and social marketing work.
Yeah. Well, so like I said, I a million times, I come from a biology background, but they hired me to be like a communications person. But I knew that I wanted to design the best possible campaign based on data, but I didn't have data. And so I learned from working with somebody from Rare, Brian Day, that I need to partner with somebody who can get the data for me. And then we also have been doing a lot of work at the International Crane Foundation with conservation planning, using the open standards for the practice of conservation. And that really fits into all of this. You have to have metrics. You have to know if you're moving in the right direction, if you're actually having an impact. I mean, there's things that we can measure, like we can measure actual confirmed shootings, but they're rare, so they're not really a great indicator. We can look at other things like the whooping crane population trends and things like that. But I really wanted to know if we are actually changing knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors with our outreach campaigns. So that's where Wade and Dr. Wade Morris at Auburn and Dr. Linda Prokopi at Purdue come in. Working with them has been really fantastic. And in general, I think, I saw at NACCB, there's a really strong social science working group that's coming out of NACCB. There's a lot of social scientists out there who are hungry for projects like this. And I was shocked at how easy it was for them to find funding. The funding for these projects costs way more than the actual outreach campaigns themselves. Linda got, I think, over $250,000 from IDNR for a 3-year program. That's more than my project costs. So that's one barrier, one reason why a lot of people just don't do the social science part of outreach or education, because they're worried about the cost. But I just couldn't really stomach not doing it, because otherwise, how are we going to know if what we're doing is really effective? So it's been so awesome. And both Linda and Wade, they're just really great to work with. And they just really get it. And everything that they do, they want to support our work, which is just awesome. So it's been really good.
You talked about messaging, and obviously you talked about the billboard you guys did and some of the challenges there. So it was, in terms of the Give a Whoop, that's a long-standing message of ICF, correct?
No, not really. Like, developing that logo happened in the first year of the campaign. We at that time we didn't have a communications director, and so it was kind of like a lot of scientists that are coming up with this messaging, and that's kind of like the most creative thing that we could think of, and it seemed to really resonate with people. So that really wasn't based on any type of data or anything like that. It just, people seemed to respond really well to it. It was like a cute logo. But it was a little bit hard to convince folks at ICF to even create that logo, because we already have a logo. And so, that's like a whole communications quandary that I still kind of struggle with. But anyways, yeah.
And then, yeah, the last question I was going to ask you. Obviously, you spoke about the value and of the article that came out of Texas Monthly and having this
Yeah.
relationship. So, maybe you can talk a little bit about how that came together. That you grabbed the attention of a reporter, and you were able to kind of help her cultivate this into a long form, feature story that really kind of put the spotlight versus, short, fleeting coverage of a court case or a fine or something like that.
Yeah, I think it was just luck. I was trying to remember, like, how did I get in contact with Sonia Smith? And I want to say that we sent out a press release and she responded to it. If you look at what Sonia has done in the past, she's written other articles about whooping cranes. She's passionate about conservation, and she's passionate about, having her journalism make an impact. So working with her was so easy, and I was so happy with the results. But yeah, typically what we get is like a one-off article that's just short, or a lot of times the AP or somebody will just pick up on our press release and print it as is. She poured so much hard work and emotion and passion into that article. I really think it came through. That magazine happens to have a national reputation. She really fought for that, to be a longer article, to really tell the story of the whooping crane. But she also, it's a really great read. She really goes into the individual whooping cranes that were shot and their backgrounds, because these birds are so rare and these cranes came from captivity. So we know so much about them, and we know where they hang out, and that we just know so much about their lives. So she really humanized them, which is so important for people to care, to give a whoop about these birds. And then she also got a lot of information about Trey Joseph Frederick and his reputation in the Beaumont community in East Texas where this occurred. And we also got lucky because he had a really bad reputation. And so we were worried that the community was going to circle the wagons around him and try to protect him. But people in that community really did not like him. And so they didn't seem to be sad at all that this was happening.
So as you mentioned, a little bit of luck. Sounds like traditional kind of, media outreach with a press release. Were there things though that, once you knew she was interested, that you were able to work with her on, or really, you felt like, hey, giving her this information or images or plugging her into, that place that, really kind of, you felt like made that story help come to life?
Yeah, I think the way I worked with Sonia is similar to the way I would work with a lot of journalists, but she was just so receptive. Like, I'm willing to spend a lot of time on the phone or in person with journalists, and give them lots of photos and insider information. At ICF, like I drop what I'm doing to work with journalists on a story, but it's just not always the case that journalists are very interested in it. Even with a shooting case, it's just, what Sonia did was kind of above and beyond. And so I'm so happy to work with journalists on things, but I think that they just have a lot of stuff to do. They've got other articles that they need to work on. Most of them can't really dedicate this much time to a single article, which I understand. And, from talking to journalists at NACCB, just getting a more of a perspective on the pressures that they deal with. It's still frustrating, though.
Last question
Yeah.
here. So obviously you mentioned you consulted with Rare and were able to use some social marketing principles and strategies. How closely did you try and follow a framework? In this course, we learned about Doug Mackenzie Moore and the community-based social marketing framework. So did you really try and strictly stick to kind of step-by-steps of like selecting behaviors and identifying strategies from there, or did you feel like you were kind of pulling some aspects and fitting it into a traditional?
Well, so in the beginning, I am really bought into that model, but the model doesn't 100% fit what we're trying to accomplish. So we want to change behaviors, but this is a really rare behavior. And so it would be really hard to measure this behavior specifically, because that's a lot of what RARE does, is they're looking at a really specific behavior change. It's a lot easier to measure than whooping crane shootings. Whooping crane shootings might not be the best indicator for us about, you know, whether we're actually having an impact on this issue. So we kind of, even though I'm talking, you know, about shootings a lot, my program has kind of stepped back and become a little bit more broad. We're looking for an increase in awareness and appreciation for whooping cranes, not just because of shootings, but because we need people to support all actions that would benefit whooping cranes, like wetland conservation, like becoming a member of the International Crane Foundation. So I still believe in the RARE model. It's just like, you know, and talking to Brian Day from RARE, he was looking at my specific case and he was like, you know, I don't know if you can adhere to every component of this. So I am kind of picking and choosing a little bit. I do wish that it was a better fit, but I certainly think that my campaign is benefiting a lot from looking at that model.
Yeah, well, I think that's great to hear, and you know, something we're again looking at in this course, in this program, are some of these principles, and I think that experience with actual application and how well you can just, you know, go step by step, and that'll meet your needs. I think that's really valuable for some students to hear too. So
yeah, it's also just really hard from like a time and a financial perspective to do everything in exactly the right order. I mean, you have to have years out, I would think, because you're supposed to assess and then pre-test, and assess, design, pre-test, and then like redesign, then do the outreach, and then do the evaluation. And it just all takes so much time. And especially when you work for a nonprofit, there's like a lot of pressure on you to move quickly. And so if you have the luxury and the ability to do every step in a thoughtful way, that's awesome. But I don't know if it's possible for all of us to do it that way.
okay, thanks.